welcome everyone. I will say again, my name is Pat Whitlow. I am the Director of Nationally Competitive Awards, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit at the beginning of the presentation today, but mostly our panelists are going to give you the benefit of their expertise and greater experience with NSF. And I do want to mention again that we are recording this and we will have it online later this week for students to access, so that you have access to these slides, most of which can come off the NSF website as well, but you'll also have access to the comments. And you can go ahead and put comments in the chat box, because I'm not sure that you can unmute yourself, but if you can, toward the end of the presentation, we'll allow you to do that too. Otherwise, we'll monitor the chat box. Allow me to introduce the panelists. Dr. Liz Debski, who is an associate professor in the Department of Biology. I think she just waved there. And I think it is Dr. Farah Williams, who is the director of Kentucky, West Virginia LSAMP. And she also works with NSF. And I think, are you on the screen there, Farah? Oh, I see, there you are. Hi. And so she works with undergraduates and also is working with graduate students right now on an NSF funded fellowship program. And Lauren Mahana, who I think I saw, she's out, there we go. And Lauren is one of our current graduate research fellows here on the UK campus, and she's in chemical engineering. And so they're going to talk to you from their different perspectives as people who have worked with candidates, as people who have received an NSF grant or fellowship, and as reviewers for the NSF. So these are our panelists. And I will talk briefly, if I can get this to move to the next thing. There we go. Well, that wasn't particularly necessary, was it? So it's in several parts, and I did take a lot of this information from NSF, most of it. But our panelists are going to weigh in. They have some specific things they're going to talk about, but they will also weigh in at various points on different topics. So, but I will start. We just wanted to make you aware of the mission of the National Science Foundation. And I think this is an element that students often skip. And I was even going to skip it today in the interest of moving faster. And Farah reminded me that, no, I shouldn't do that. So thank you there. But it is important to know the motivations of the funding agency that you're applying to. It is important to know what they value so that you can keep that in mind as you are writing your application materials. And this is a federal government program, and it is for US citizens only, so be aware of that, or permanent residents, I think, as well. It does fund a lot of basic research, so that is something to think. And there are some caveats. It does not fund direct health research, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it funds a lot of graduate students, but definitely think about their goals. They are really interested in your potential as a scientist. So for those of you who may not have a lot of research experience, we have maybe both undergraduates on this call, and we have graduate students. So I don't want you to be discouraged. Maybe you're coming to UK from a smaller institution, or maybe you're an undergraduate that some of your research plans got disrupted by COVID, and we understand that's been happening to a lot of students. So, but they are recognizing your potential. And so I want you to think of that when you are working on your application, and to understand that the NSF is very, very interested in broadening science and the various fields, and that is a very important component. Here are some of the features. I want to say briefly, when it says awarded to the individual, yes, it is awarded to you, not your PI or not, but it actually will come through your graduate institution. So for example, Lauren's stipend, I think, comes through the graduate school, and her tuition gets paid by the graduate school here at UK. So I just want to be clear about that. It doesn't just all come to you directly as a check. they allow you to change, even though you may talk about a project and talk in your application. Well, you will talk about a project. You can change it when you go into your graduate program. You can change your advisor. You can change the program you think you're going to attend. So it's flexible in that way. You can use it at any campus in the U.S. for these research-based degrees. It has an opportunity for you to go on reserve for a year. So let's say that you get the fellowship and it will fund, let's say, 3 years of your PhD, 2 years of a master's degree, but you get another fellowship from the school that you're attending. So you could put your NSF award on reserve for a year to take up that other funding, and then you could come back. So it's wonderfully flexible for you, and that will give you some idea there of the fellowships and the number of applications, so that you have a sense of how many students are applying. I will also, Lauren, if you want to weigh in on the benefits maybe at UK, the stipend was increased a couple of years ago, so it's $34,000, but this $12,000 educational allowance, actually the tuition at UK may be more than that now for a graduate student, but the graduate school covers all of it. Is that not correct?
Yeah, so basically everything that you would get on your financial statement is like your tuitions and fees and everything, all of that gets covered through this educational allowance. So basically whatever that kind of whatever comes through the UK My Financials account statement, all of that gets covered within like the first month of every semester.
Okay. So if you would happen to go to an institution where the tuition was more than that, in many cases the institution does cover that. There probably are some institutions where it might not be, maybe a very expensive private, but I would imagine in most cases, but you would ask that, of course, maybe to the institution you're attending. But I think that in many cases I have heard that it is covered. And then there are some other NS opportunities that they're making you aware of. But we'll focus on today on the Graduate Research Fellowship. And I'm going to bring up eligibility briefly, and there are some complications to this, so there are a couple of slides on this, but feel free, anyone, to log in on this and make comments. So it is for citizens, nationals, and permanent residents. It is a federal government funded award. It is for early career, and we'll talk about how this could affect graduate students. You want to be pursuing a research-based degree, so it will not fund medical school. I get that question a lot. It will not fund medical school or dental school or pharmacy or those kinds of things. And it is for STEM fields. Psychology applies in certain categories of psychology and not in others, so you want to look carefully at your eligibility. Now, I will let people read this. But I do want to say to graduate students, because I think Dr. Debsky reminded me that I think in the initial poster we put out, we just had first-year graduate students. We didn't make it clear that you could also apply in your second year, particularly in certain cases. And then also as returning graduate students. So please carefully check your eligibility before you start your application, because that is something that you want to think about. And also, it will note, I think a little bit later, but seniors can apply more than one time, because it may be, for example, that as a senior you are taking a gap year before you go to graduate school, or you worked for a couple of, you know what I mean, that you can actually apply in that year that you are not officially enrolled. So you might get a couple of chances at it. Oh, well, there, it does say that. So it says when you can apply every year. It does sounds like a lot of times. Most seniors I know apply once or twice. So this is for graduate students. So you want to be careful, and perhaps Farah, I don't know if you would want to weigh in on the strategy of this for graduate students.
I think it depends on how prepared you are for your graduate program and the research project, or your faculty mentors help in writing a research proposal. And you definitely want to make sure that it's a solid application since you only get one try as a grad student.
Yes, definitely. And we'll talk about this, but you want to really give yourself enough time. That's why we are doing this fairly early, because the deadlines are in October and we want you to have as much time as possible. These are the eligible fields of study. I don't know if anyone wants to comment among our panelists about this. It's somewhat straightforward. There are also subfields, and this is just an example of one that they will all be online and in the solicitation, but you should go and check your subfield. My understanding is that you want to be careful about the subfield you choose because that affects how you are reviewed and what committees review you. And I'm sure people will talk about that later, but it's not, you want to be careful and look through the subfields.
And also I know some students do interdisciplinary research that may, kind of lie in more than one different field. So it's, again, you have to really think through what is your research field in terms of that project. And again, this is where your faculty mentors can help you a lot in determining which field or which subfield makes most sense for your, not the only sense, but the best sense for your application.
Because you can only pick one. So you want, yes. So I just want to make you aware of ineligible fields, and you can go back and study this a little more carefully. But I realize that all students are looking for funding for their graduate work and often for their professional program and applied, but it won't fund certain kinds of programs. So you don't want to put a lot of work into this application and then find out it wasn't the right field for you. There might be other options for you to think about, a Fulbright or an NIH or other different opportunities that you would have. So please be careful when you look at this. And if your research is following, is into patient oriented or agricultural production or something, then let's find some other things that you could take a look at to support your research and graduate study. And so I think this is what we were speaking of carefully, make sure you're choosing the right field of study, make sure you're choosing the right subfield. We want you to, it also is going to talk about this. If you choose a chemistry field, you can't enroll in chemical engineering. So we were saying earlier, you can change things about your fellowship in terms of like the graduate program or the advisor, but there are certain things you can't change. So these are all elements that you want to be careful with in setting up the application. This is almost preparatory before you go into writing your statements. And I think I was going to turn it over here to Farah, and she was going to talk a little bit more about the application timeline before talking about the research statement.
Yeah, so pay close attention to the timeline. The deadlines, again, October may seem like it's a long ways off, but it's not. Especially with this proposal, you are literally applying for thousands and tens of thousands of dollars. So be aware of the timeline. And I would actually, if you have, a paper and pencil or computer right now, draw your own timeline that ends with that application's due step that they show here and starts today. So make your own timeline. And these are the deadlines from last year, but this year's deadlines are very similar. So they are October 12th for life sciences and October 19th for life science and October 22nd for chemistry. But here's where I also want you on your own timeline, make your deadline the week before this deadline. Because if you notice in red there, it says no exceptions, no extensions. So give yourself a buffer of a week to have your application done and submitted instead of waiting till that, and it's actually 4 p.m. now instead of 5 p.m. If on October 22nd, your chemistry and at 3 p.m. your computer crashes or your internet starts giving trouble, there are no excuses, there are no exceptions. You're not considered. It's going to be automatically rejected or not accepted. So you want to make sure that you make the deadline, and the best way to do that is to submit early. So I would encourage you to make your deadline the week before the dates of your deadline. And the same thing with your reference letters. Ask your reference letters and tell them that so instead of November 1st, and actually it's October 30th is the official deadline, I would tell your recommenders that you need it by October 23rd. Let them know that you have a deadline.
And I will get an updated slide and put it up with this presentation. We'll have a link to it, or we'll have it next to it, so that you have those as well. I mean, you can get it from the NSF website, but we'll also put it out in different places for you as well.
Yeah, definitely. So next slide. So again, give yourself plenty of time. So on that timeline that you just drew, for those of you who are still undergrads and this year isn't your deadline, congratulations, you have a whole year to prepare for this process. But that doesn't mean that you need to wait until next September before you start doing anything. Go ahead and on your timeline, set some goals of things for you to do, once a month, make progress on your application process, because though the application may change slightly, year to year, it's pretty close to the same. So give yourself time and really focus in and give that buffer. Make sure, try to submit early. So before beginning, these are good questions. And this whole slide deck came from the nsfgrfp.org, which that address we'll give to you probably multiple times before the session is over. That is the most useful website for planning your proposal. They give you good tips. They give you all kinds of information on that website, and it's going to be a great resource for you. But these are great questions to ask yourself before you even start writing anything, before you choose your field. What are the answers to these questions that are going to help you in developing your best proposal? And so again, the personal information, this is where I like to tell people, for those of you who have participated in an NSF REU, a research experience for undergraduates, for example, or a Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation program, or some other NSF funded program, or if you've conducted research and your faculty mentors research is funded by NSF. NSF loves to fund NSF. So that means in your application packet, whether it's on your resume or in your essays, somewhere in that document, you need to have the information about that NSF project or support that you have already received. So make sure that you put that in there. When you're writing your personal statements, and we'll talk more about this down the line, but it's important to make sure that it's about you. And there where it says letters of reference, 3 letters are needed. I would actually ask you to ask 4 people for a letter, but with that 4th person, you're going to tell them specifically, I would like for you to be my emergency letter of recommendation. And what that means is you're going to give those other 3 people the information and the deadline of that October 23rd to get you a letter of recommendation. But then you're going to tell that 4th person that if one of those 3 falls through and doesn't come through with a letter for you, you're going to ask them that week, that's why you give yourself a buffer. You're going to ask them in that last week to give you a letter of recommendation, and they're going to know that, you may ask them short notice, but they're prepared for it. They're going to have one ready to give to you in a day or 2 turnaround. But that keeps you from having your application completely rejected because you don't have a letter of recommendation. Okay, the last thing you want is for you to put all the work into your essays and your statements and your transcripts and all the work that you put into this application just to have it rejected because somebody else didn't come through with a letter of recommendation. So give yourself that support and that background to have that emergency letter ready. So all NSF proposals are graded or evaluated using these 2 criteria. And it's very important that you pay attention to the information that is in the solicitation or in the the information that you get about the GRFP, because you want to make sure that you're meeting and talking about what NSF is looking for. So what is the benefit to society for the broader impacts? What are the importance of your particular research project that you're proposing? How is it going to make a difference within your field? And I think the next slide has a little more detail.
Sarah, can I ask a question that came in the chat? What would you suggest for undergraduates graduating in December 2021? Could we apply this year, or should we wait until next year to apply?
If you feel that you are confident and have a research background and you have faculty that can help you through the process, it would not hurt for you to go ahead and submit this year, because you as an undergraduate, you do have that buffer and that ability to apply more than once. But if you don't feel that you have the time to commit to the application process and to really get a great personal statement, research statement, and all that together, it may be one that you want to wait on. It's more of a personal choice, but really know that if you do submit this year, you want to make sure that it's as good as you can get it. But you do have the ability, if you can get it to be a good application, go ahead and submit. You may, that way if you get accepted, then you don't have to wait for your funding, and you could actually begin getting support your very first semester.
If I could just add, I think everyone wants to keep in mind at the review level, the criteria with which we view these applications changes. So if you are an undergraduate, we are expecting less than if you are applying as a second-year graduate student. And so especially the way that they have it set up now, where you can only apply once as a graduate student, if you I don't really see any downside to applying as an undergraduate, because then you get familiar with the process. You will get some feedback on your application. And I think you will just get the experience to put together a better application if you should not be funded and have to do so again as a graduate student.
Yeah, can I add to that too? So I applied as an undergraduate, as a senior, got an honorable mention, and then applied again as my first year of grad studies, and then ended up getting accepted that year. So I completely recommend applying as an undergrad if you have the time and can put in effort on your application. Like what we've already been saying, you've got nothing to lose. And one of the biggest takeaways you can get from your applications are the reviews that you get back from the people who read them. So even if you don't get it that first year, those reviews are really telling as to what people actually want to see in your application. So if you do have to apply a second time, you now have a much better idea of how to structure your essays or what kind of content people are going to look for specifically when they read them. So if you can go ahead and apply now, I would definitely recommend it.
Exactly. So again, make sure that you're paying attention to the intellectual merit as well as the broader impact. I'm not going to read because everybody knows how to read. But these are going to be very important. What is your approach? Again, make sure that you're talking about you. If you're talking about the larger project of the lab, that's not going to be specific enough. You want to talk about you and what you can do.
I have one other question I'll ask, and maybe y'all will want to address this later, but there are some inherently epidemiologic aspects to physiology as a whole, yet physiology is one of the subsets for GRFP. At what point does a project cross the line into not applicable for an NSF grant? Liz, is that something you can address?
Sure, it has to be basic research and not clinical research. So if you are trying to find out an idea about something, then so it used to be if you were working with animals rather than humans, it was NSF. And if it was humans, it was clinical and NIH. Actually, they've relaxed that a little bit in the last couple of years so that you can be doing something that is um, uh, applicable to humans, directly applicable to humans, as long as it is a basic research question and not just a matter of giving them a drug to cure this disease or something like that. Yeah, does that answer? It's the same as neuroscience. You know, it's the same as uh, epidemiology, actually. Yeah, virology. If it's a basic question, you know, how does a virus work? How does um, how does a heart work? Those are all fundable by NSF.
And as y'all have mentioned, if a student is not completely sure, an advisor would be likely to be able to weigh in on that. Correct? I mean, that might be
Yes.
someone.
Sometimes, although plenty of grants go to NSF that are not going to be funded by NSF because they are considered more clinical. Uh, you know, so uh, those grants will never reach the review process. And if a person makes a mistake with the GRFP and tries to put forward, all those grants are read beforehand at NSF before they ever go out for review. So we only get to review the ones that fit their criteria.
That's a good point. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and there was another question in the chat. I noticed that if you're an undergraduate and not yet a senior, should you apply? I would not apply if you're not a senior, because you still have time to work on that proposal and also to build your own skills. I don't know how many students I've talked to that, you know, may change their interests or their passions within that last year of school. So the best thing would be to start the application process now, but not necessarily submit until you are a senior in undergrad. And so broader impacts, again, you want to contribute to, so this is how will your project contribute not just to your field, but to society in general. How is it going to expand or make things better in society? It's really important to, again, the broader impacts and intellectual merit is the same criteria that is used on every NSF proposal at every level, every size, whether it's a $10,000 mini grant or a multi-million-dollar multi-year grant. Those are the two criteria that NSF looks for. So you want to make sure that you're meeting those two criteria. And I think on this slide, one thing I want to make sure to point out is NSF has software that will kick out proposals that do not have these formatting requirements. So if your font is the wrong size or your margins are the wrong size, it automatically gets spit out and is not reviewed at all. Nobody reads it, it's gone. So make sure that you are following the formatting requirements of the proposal.
And this is an easy thing to do, but the reason why I left it in is people neglect this. So please pay attention to that.
Yes.
Lauren, I think we were going to ask you to talk about the personal statement.
Yes, so the personal statement is basically 3 pages of you talking about yourself. So this is where you tell kind of your story, you talk about kind of what you've done to build your resume, everything to kind of tell like what you're doing now and how you're getting to where you want to go. So the way I kind of like to think about the personal statement is thinking kind of a big picture. So like, where are you going to see yourself in 5 to 10 years? And then kind of showing that how you've decided to get on the path you're going and then where you're going with this. So for me, like I am in chemical engineering and I wanted to be more in the world of bioengineering. So doing things that benefit kind of applications in medicine, but not directly. So for me, I saw myself wanting to be in like a biomedical researcher. So when I was tailoring how I was writing this personal statement, I was trying to tailor it to how are these experiences that I've been having, how are those setting me up to be successful as a biomedical researcher. And so basically when you're writing this, you want to make it as easy for a reviewer to be able to score you based on the criteria they're looking for. So we've already talked about the fact that they want to look for intellectual merit and broader impacts. So what I did with my application is I specifically used headers, intellectual merit, wrote out paragraphs based on intellectual merit, had a section for broader impacts, and then wrote paragraphs about that. So that way, when they go to score you, and if you get reviews back later, you'll see they actually write comments specifically about intellectual merit or broader impacts. So that's something to kind of keep in mind here. So something else I've found important with your personal statement is 3 pages is not a lot when you kind of start writing this out. Make sure that you are being concise and that you're getting straight to the point. So don't use don't use a lot of jargon, don't use like wordy sentences, try to be concise. And this might be something that would be helpful when you go to edit more. It might be something that's helpful when other people read your statements as well. And so that's something to kind of think about. When I'm writing my statements, it's also kind of easy for a reviewer to skim through and just kind of get lost in certain paragraphs. So you want to make sure you're highlighting exactly what you want a reviewer to see. So one thing you can kind of think about is bolding or italicizing certain sentences within your proposal. And that way, if you have something that's really important, that you're able to show your reviewer that that's something that meant a lot to you and that's really helped you to get to where you are. So in writing my personal statement, the intellectual merit section focused a lot on my previous experiences. So that involved coursework that I've taken that I think has helped me. It's involved different undergraduate research experiences. And for those, I basically, if they were important, I tried to dedicate a couple sentences to a paragraph about each one. And then this would also include things about like internships or externships that have helped you. And so the one thing that's been really important in trying to craft your sections of your personal statement, especially in these intellectual merit, is not just that you've done an experience, it's that what did you gain from the experience? What did you learn from it? So just saying that I've done research, that's great, but a lot of people applying have done research. So you need to know, what did you learn from it? Did you learn that you can work in a team? Did you learn that you have faced failure and you've been able to bounce back from it? Did you take initiative with certain projects? So try to, every time you make a paragraph about an experience, try to end it with some kind of highlight about what you actually learned. That's kind of a good way for people to see where you're going with this. And so that's sometimes one of those sentences that you can bold. So like, this experience taught me XYZ, and then bold that. So that's a lot to do with the intellectual merit. The broader impacts has more to do with how you're benefiting society as a whole. So these focus more on some of the outreach activities you've been a part of. That can include educational opportunities, that can include mentorship of other students, that can include leadership roles you've taken on in organizations, showing that you've helped delegate and lead teams before. So with all of these, you want to show, again, not just that you participated in various activities, but what you've actually were able to accomplish, what you've learned from it, and how it's helped you kind of grow into this person that you are, and why they should fund you to be able to do research independently on your own. And so then generally the way I like to kind of wrap up my personal statement is then kind of leading back to this big picture that I had. So for me, this big picture was I wanted to be a biomedical scientist. So I had kind of a future goals paragraph or two of where I kind of want to see myself, whether or not that is kind of as this researcher, how I see myself impacting other people, kind of addressing that broader impacts again, and kind of where I want to be doing my research. So just trying to be able to wrap all of that up pretty concisely. And so we've mentioned this a little bit just a second ago, but make sure that you're targeting NSF specifically in these applications. So NSF wants to fund good science. They aren't really interested in trying to overlap with all these different funding agencies. So for me, where I wanted to be kind of in that bioengineering realm, it was really important that I didn't overlap too much with NIH territory, which is that clinical outcomes. So for me, it's making sure that when I was writing this, I wasn't using any medical related jargon that steered it too much towards that NIH territory. So for me, making sure I use the word scientist a lot, or I looked at how we were performing good science is something that was important instead of steering it too much into that clinical world. And so that's something about the personal statement. And yeah, so I guess anytime throughout, if you all have questions, you can also feel free to ask as well.
Lauren, did you get your mentor to read your statement and give feedback to before you submit it?
Yeah, so everything I did with this application, I did with my mentor. So the person that I currently do research with was somebody that I actually had interacted and worked with a little bit in my undergraduate time here at UK. So I worked very specifically with him. Every time I was writing drafts, we kind of would email them back and forth and bounce ideas off each other. And so for the personal statement, I would say it's a little bit more focused on yourself. So this is one that you're going to contribute a lot to, and your mentor can help you craft your ideas, but a lot of the information is coming from you. The one I would suggest for sure, always getting advice from a professor on, is your research statement. That one can be a little bit of new territory for a lot of undergrads, because we're not as familiar in the world of writing grants and proposals. So making sure you're working with an advisor, especially one who has submitted to NSF before and knows the process, is important. Yes.
And
Thank you.
Pat, I would like to jump in. When you're ready and you think your personal statement is almost complete, I would highly recommend you having 3 different people read it. One would be your research mentor or a scientist who might understand that part of what you wrote. One would be a grammar person who may not understand what you're writing, but they're going to know the sentence structure and the flow, and that your punctuation and grammar is all correct. And then the third would be a friend, maybe not necessarily a scientist, but somebody who knows you as a person. And when they read it, they should hear you talking to them. And if they read something that doesn't match your personality, they should let you know, because you need the statement to be completely you 100%.
Good point. And I think, Farah, were you going to talk a little bit about the research statement, or did I?
I can. So the research statement is, again, it's much like your personal statement, but it's more research focused on the project itself. I think the important thing to remember here is, one, some of the reviewers may or may not be in the field that you're going to. Most of them probably will be, but maybe not all of them. So don't write it assuming that they will be able to understand everything. So make sure you put it in terms that everybody will understand. And then the other thing is to also make sure that you, again, put it a little bit about you, and understand that you are not 100% committed to what you write. So don't go into it thinking, this is exactly what I have to do. What NSF, I believe, is looking for is that you know how to ask a question and how to set up a project to answer that question. They're not as much concerned with what you actually end up doing once you get funded as they are with knowing that you know what to do once you get the money, you know how to put it to use.
Yeah, and to add on to that, the project that I proposed in my NSF application, I am not doing at all. So, and I'm sure that's the way for a lot of applicants. So just putting a good idea out there and making sure you're backing it up with your ideas and the feasibility of it is really what's important.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there too and say that the only purpose of the research statement for the reviewers is to show your potential as a scientist, to show that you can identify a problem, you can give a possible way to solve that question, and most importantly, and this is the stuff that's still left out, you can interpret the results of that experiment and have a way to show that you can deal with the data, analyze the data, and uh, uh, understand that it may not come out the way that you think it will, and so you should discuss alternative possibilities. So all the things that a scientist really has to do when they're in the lab should be demonstrated in your research statement. And it also has to be written in your voice. There is absolutely nothing worse and nothing that will get an application scored low than for the personal statement to be in one voice and the research statement to be in another. We are not funding a project. NSF is not funding a project. It doesn't want to see what your advisor has in their NSF or NIH submission, right? It's important that you demonstrate that you can communicate about science to again, other people. And the panels are made up of, normally I'm on the neuroscience panel. I have served on ecology panels as well. But neuroscience is a huge field, many different areas of neuroscience. And if you immediately go into your little pathway with your little genes without having explained the relevance, you will not be viewed as having communicated the general importance of your project to people.
I think I'll let you guys read this later because it's pretty clear and it's just to give you information on that. We talked a little bit about reference letters. So this is really more, I think, to your recommenders, advice for them. So this might be something to share with them. But I will say to you, ask people who know you well. And I sometimes, it's hard is sometimes if you don't know a lot of people, and this may be for seniors, if you don't have a lot of faculty, but it's very difficult. Someone who knows you only very slightly, it might be hard for them to write you a letter of the caliber that you need. So really think about that. Your research mentor obviously is a good person. Someone that you've taken several classes with might be another. But really think about your contacts. And I would say in most cases, we do want scientists or people in the field, but Farah and Liz, do you agree with that?
Yes, so for the most part, it should be a research person because you're applying for research money. But again, that's the fourth person I talked about. So your emergency letter writer could be, an advisor of a student organization. That's where I fill the gap for many of the LSAMP scholars. I serve as their emergency recommender. It's also important to note that you need to respect your recommenders and that don't ask them today for a letter tomorrow or next week. They are faculty. They're extremely busy. Just as you are busy, faculty are extremely busy as well. Don't ask them during finals week or midterm week because just as you are busy with those tests, so are they. Be respectful of their time and their effort. Ask them if they have the time to give you a strong letter of recommendation. Let me say that again. Ask them if they have the time to give you a strong letter of recommendation. And if they say no, then respect that because obviously they're very busy and they don't have the time right now for that. But when you ask them if they say yes, also provide them with your resume or CV and then a few bullet points of what you have done with them. Because even if it's your research mentor, they have other mentees that they work with, and they may not at that moment in time when they're in the middle of writing this letter in the late hours, as many faculty write these, so that's the time they have to do so. You know, you want to give them some bullet points of what you have done with them so that they don't have to stop and think about that. They can like, oh yeah, we worked on this project and that's what he or she did that really impressed me at that time. And they're going to get a better letter to you, and it's going to be to you in a quicker time frame.
Good point.
And I'm also going to say, don't forget that broader impacts is a very important part of this application. They want to see people that are going to, or identify people who are going to be leaders in their community, communicating science to the lay public, or I don't know, teaching in schools or something like that. But just, I mean, it's truly not enough just to be doing great science. You have to be also bringing that science to the public, and there's many ways of doing that. There's many ways, but letters from people who have seen you in that role is important. All right, so that you know your research mentor may see you in the lab, may be able to talk a lot about what you've done in terms of a particular project, how you've contributed to a particular paper, et cetera, but may not be able to really talk about what you've done in the community. And so we say 3 letters. You know, you can have 4 letters come in. We read 4 letters, right? So the applications that we see have anywhere from 2 to 4 letters. And so I think there is room to have people who have seen what you're doing with science to actually provide letters as well.
And it was
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Okay, I will add just that every single one of my reviewers that I had, all of them commented on my letters of recommendation. So even though this is not something you're doing specifically, it's a big component of your application, and what they say about you does mean a lot to those people reading your applications. And so what I would kind of think about is the different experiences you talk about within your personal statement. Try to have somebody who can back you up on all of those. So if you say like, I worked at this company for a summer internship, try to have someone at that company who can vouch for you and say, you know, you were, you know, a really good worker, you did what you needed to. And if you feel confident enough with the people who are writing those letters, even providing them things that you specifically want them to talk about is really important. So maybe one experience, you had a lot of mentorship and you want to say, could you just talk about a lot of my mentorship abilities? And you know that another letter isn't going to talk about that as much. So being candid with these people writing your, you know, letters of recommendation, and if you feel comfortable with it, making sure each one is unique and can talk about your different attributes.
We also had a question, should we waive the right to read our letters before they are sent?
Yes.
Yes. I don't even know that you have access to NSF letters, but if you do, you should definitely waive it because you need the people to be candid.
And as a campus fellowship advisor, I would say that advice goes for everything.
Yeah.
If you're applying for a major award, waive your rights, or for graduate school, yes, you should do that.
But I would just like to follow up on a point that Lauren made, you know, with regard to having letters from people from the experiences that you've highlighted in your personal statement. So if you're saying that this experience made you, you know, go down this road or was very formative in determining your current plan, and you don't have a letter to back it up, right? That looks very suspicious to the reviewers, right? Especially if it was something that otherwise seems very productive and very important. It does not look good. You know, some people have highlighted when they go to graduate school, they do rotations, and this rotation was really important to them, and then they don't have a letter from that person. It looks bad. It actually looks bad. So make sure, if you are going to say that this experience was important to you, you have a letter from someone who can vouch that you were as productive as you say at this place.
We have a few more questions, but before we do that, why don't I let Liz talk a little bit about the application review process, and then we'll go back at the end and get the question, pick up a couple more questions.
Okay, so I've been a reviewer for this program for many years, including the last couple of years. The review process has changed quite a bit over the years, but I'll give you sort of last year's, the way it was last year. And basically at this time, it's all being done remotely. So we get about 15 to 20 applications to read sometime in December. And we are then reviewing and submitting our reviews of those applications to talk about them in a virtual meeting that is usually now scheduled for January. So we have now, and this is different from in the past, actually a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks to read these applications. And the applications are just handed out randomly to panel members. So right now, they're putting together these panels of, say, neuroscientists or ecologists or physiologists, and then NSF sees what comes in, and they just, as long as you don't have a conflict with the application, you are supposed to read it. You can, having read it, decline to review it by saying that you don't feel you have the expertise to do that, but that's actually really frowned upon, because as we've already pointed out, one of the important parts of this application is that you have the ability to communicate your science. If you can't communicate your science to another scientist in your general field, that's looked upon as a problem with the application, right? So they're given out randomly. We, as Lauren also said when she was talking about her reviews, we have 2 areas in which we have to rate the applications: intellectual merit, broader impacts. NSF no longer tells us how to weigh those 2. You know, so for many panels I was on in the past, it had to be 50-50, right? Now they're not telling us. We're supposed to just come to a general sense by sort of evaluating these 2 areas, what the applicant's potential is to be a leader in science. All right, so we skipped over the transcript slide. I'm just going to say one of the first things we see is, if you put it in your GPA. I would say, unless you have a GPA of 3.9 or higher, don't put your GPA in if they are still allowing it. That is because you are competing against, you know, a very different pool, a pool of applicants that is very accomplished. It does not mean that you have to have a GPA that high to be to write a competitive application. You don't, but you want to make sure that people are going directly to your transcripts to evaluate what kinds of courses you actually took. People come into these or apply to these programs having very different backgrounds, having very different kind of preparations. Make sure that, again, the first thing that people do is look at your transcripts to see what kind of preparation you have. And then uh, uh, Lauren, I think, did a really good job at talking about the personal statement. Just remember, it has to be in your voice and it has to be woven together as a story. We still get applications that kind of bullet, this experience, and talk just what did I do technically. That really doesn't have any impact at all, right? What you want is a nice, you know, woven story, even if you didn't know you were creating a story while you were doing it, that comes down to say, I am the best person, the absolute best person to be now tackling this question or this problem that I'm going to tell you about. All right. Um, yeah. And again, just participation is not enough. What people are looking for is leadership abilities. Leadership abilities. So make sure that you don't leave that out, in lieu of putting together just I did this, I did this, I did this. Right? It's just not going to be that effective because, again, we're reading lots and lots and lots of these applications. Everybody has, I've got to say, pretty similar kinds of experiences, right? And it's what you actually took from that experience that then becomes really important. And then, of course, your research proposal, sort of the worst thing you can do. NSF is not funding a project. It honestly is not really caring about this, as long as it meets the funding eligibility of the directorate, right? So you can change projects. People think it's a contract. People think that they should copy out things from, their mentors, NIH or NSF grant. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Just, again, make it in your own voice. So the intellectual merit is coming from that research project. It's coming from um, we didn't talk about any kinds of product that you have. So even if you haven't a published paper, if you've done abstracts, if you've done meeting presentations, if you've done anything, make sure that you're actually listing that right up front in the application where it asks for those things, and not taking up room in your research or personal statement and not omitting it from the application, right? Because we need that for intellectual merit, and we need, something. Broader impacts used to be only about experiences, whether you were doing a web page, whether you were doing, again, teaching in high schools or elementary schools, reaching out to those students is a common kind of thing. Remember also that some universities have programs in which a student can just plug into programs like that. That's kind of unusual at UK, right? But the reviewers know about those schools. So we know what UCSF and Stanford do. And and it's more important that a student actually show their own commitment to doing whatever they're doing in terms of broader impacts than actually just joining this because you need to, someone is making you do it, or you need to have it so that you can submit this application. Any leadership that you can highlight is really important. And so that, of course, counts for broader impacts. The other important part of that now is they are allowing people to highlight parts of their research program more and count that as broader impacts. So, you know, that's always a little more difficult because, man, everyone's research is important, you know, at some level, but certainly when you talk about sort of the ecologists and they may be doing a program with whales or something, they're always highlighting that, you know, that their work or their project will help increase understanding of diversity and so forth and so on. So all of that, we highlight broader impacts. We have to write our critique of intellectual merit. Then we have a summary statement, and we have a score. We are scoring you on all of these things. The scoring goes 1 to 50, with the closer you are to 50 being a better score. Applicants don't see those scores. You only get our comments, but we are scoring everything. And then when the panel comes together in their virtual meeting, right? The applications, so each application gets 3 readings now, 3 readings from 3 individual members of the panel, 3 scores, right? And so then they're ranked with the highest scores down to the lowest scores. And they are put into 3 quality groups. Quality 1, which means that everyone in this group is going to be funded. Quality Group 2, which means some of the people, but not all, are going to be funded. And Quality Group 3, where nobody's going to be funded, right? How many people go into Quality Group 1 depends on how much funding NSF has, right? But the panel has complete control over who gets into that group, just based on the rankings, and then if there's some discussion needed about that group, we go into a discussion to sort of either justify having that person in that group, or sometimes we will take a person out of that group and move a person from Quality Group 2, the highest in Quality Group 2, up to Quality Group 1, right? That's because everybody in that group that the panel puts in that group will be funded. For Quality Group 2, that's where NSF comes in and the program officer's discretion comes in. And so people in Quality Group 2, it's better if you're higher up in that group, you stand a better chance of being funded than if you're lower in that group. But again, other considerations that NSF has will also determine who will be funded in that group. So it's not just the reviews. And one of the very important ones for Kentucky is regional distribution of these fellowships. So they don't want all the fellowships. NSF doesn't want all the money going to Massachusetts and California and New York, right? And so regionally, they will try to, as long as a person has a high enough score in Quality Group 2, they will try to get that person funded. Also, diversity. If you are diverse in any way, and I know that many people don't like to say that in these applications, that's where a letter from somebody who knows you well, if you don't feel you want to say it, really, you know, have somebody, one of your letter writers, highlight it, because diversity is important to NSF. And again, if you have a high enough score, the program officer may get you into where you will be funded. So panel, total discretion over funding in Quality Group 1. Program officer gets to decide who's going to be funded in Quality Group 2. All right, so I think that's, I hope, a quick look at the review process. And again, during our virtual meeting, we're going to discuss, if there's discrepancies in the scoring. So two people have scored a application very high and one person scores it really low. That's when we have it out. And people have to actually finally agree and bring their scores closer so that they are not divergent. And that can mean lowering the two scores that were high, and sometimes it means just getting that person who scored it low to recognize other assets in the application that they didn't immediately see, and bringing their score up. So there is movement typically at these meetings in terms of where the applications are ranked.
Dr. Debski, there are a couple of questions here. Let me ask you I took a 5-year gap after undergraduate to return to get my PhD. I was planning to have 2 UK faculty and 1 undergraduate professor do the recommendations. In my gap years, I worked as a clinical microbiologist. Would it be better to have a previous employer write a letter, even if they don't have research academia experience?
You should definitely have a clinical, previous employer write you a letter. You spent all that time doing that. You learn techniques. They can evaluate you in a research setting. It would be really important. Again, you can have 4 letters. You can have 4 letters. So no reason not to reach out to this person, someone in this company or environment who writes you a letter, who can write you a strong letter, let me say.
In high school, I worked on a NASA project. I presented posters at national conferences and contributed to 2 published papers, but that was 4 or 5 years ago and ended when I graduated high school. That seems too old to me to be of use now in terms of a letter of recommendation, she's saying, or am I wrong? Is 5-year absence too long?
She's wrong. It's definitely applicable. There are not very many people in this country who have high school research that is publication quality. You definitely need to make sure that that is mentioned somewhere in your application packet.
And all I would say is you may have to set that person up a little bit more, remind them a little bit more, you know, of you and what you've been doing and all of that kind of thing. So the person may want to write you a letter, but, you know, that was a long time ago. Their records, their memories may not be that good. So just be willing to put in the little work to remind them of you know, what you actually have done in the past with them and are doing now. That's also to bring the letter up to date. That person can have the perspective of commenting on what you've done after you had the experience with them. That can be a very important perspective.
And remember, you can go to 4 letters, everyone. So that could be perhaps your 4th letter if you feel like that person doesn't know you as well or you haven't been in contact in a while and you're less sure. I would also, I don't know if everyone can see the chat box, but Professor Sundaram did write in regards to letters. My answer would be that you should waive the right to read the letters. And I think we all agreed with that earlier. If I am unable to provide a strong and supportive letter for the student, I will say so. But having agreed, I expect the student to trust that I will follow through. Otherwise, it's better for the student to ask someone else. So I definitely think you should waive. I think a lot of faculty and recommenders are sensitive to that. And yeah, they're not out to sabotage you if they agree to write your letter. So if your concern is something like that, that just rarely do I find that to be the case. Any other last comments? We've gone over a little bit of time, and so I thank you very much for my panelists. I may have spoken too much in the beginning, and thank you also to our students and any faculty who are also on the call. We really appreciate it. Anything we should say at the last that we could have left out?
Yeah, I think if you go to the next slide, I think it's very important. The very last thing
critical, yes,
is to definitely make sure it is submitted. I've heard many stories where students don't hit the submit button. or they think they hit it, but it wasn't they didn't confirm and it wasn't submitted. So make sure you submit the application.
And everything on there you can preview before you hit submit. So if you think for some reason, like maybe this font isn't correct or something isn't showing through correctly, you preview the PDF first. You can go through the entirety of your application and make sure it looks good. And then on another note, the recommenders you choose, you can see when they submit your recommendation letters. So even though you're not writing the recommendation letters, making sure you follow up and seeing that those are being submitted is important. I know it's important to start early. So if you ask somebody for a recommendation now, it's possible that it may have slipped their mind a little bit. And so make sure when you get into October and you're doing that application that you keep checking on those submissions, and you can kind of lightly remind some professors, you know, if they've forgotten, because it's kind of a hectic time of the semester when this is due as well.
Yeah, it's not nagging. It's quite all right to ask. And definitely, this is why we're telling you to apply early, because there are lots of moving parts that have to come together in this one application. And so you want to be able to get all your materials. If something should happen to one of your recommenders and they need to pull out, you want to be able to ask someone else. There are just, hopefully everything will go well with yours, but sometimes something will happen and you want to have time to react to events.
And again, applying early is so critical. I don't know how many people out there are familiar or have heard of the Gates Millennium Scholarship, but one year their application system actually crashed the day of the deadline. So any students who are planning to submit that day, their applications just weren't accepted. So you do not want to fall into that category. Make sure you apply early.
You absolutely don't. And here are the websites. I'm just pushing this so that we get it into the Zoom so that students will have access to this, but we will get it posted and we will get the updated deadlines out for you. So my thanks to everyone for participating today. I appreciate it. Thank you.